Welcome to this explainer. Look, if you've ever interacted with an enterprise Java web application, and let's be real, you absolutely have, you've felt the ripple effects of the framework we're exploring today. We're talking about Apache Struts, the foundational pioneer that quite literally revolutionized how we build the modern Java web. Okay, let's dive into this. What actually built the foundation for the Java apps we rely on every single day? Before we had all these modern, lightweight microservices, there had to be a trailblazer, right? Something that brought order to the absolute Wild West of early web development? Let's uncover the history of a framework that changed the game forever. So, here's our roadmap for the journey. We'll start with the birth of Struts and its popularization of MVC architecture. Then we'll see how inspired modern Java frameworks, unpack the need for Struts 2, examine some critical security lessons, and finally look at its massive open-source legacy. Part 1. The birth of Struts, bringing order to chaos. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that year right there, the year 2000. To fully appreciate Struts, you kind of have to picture the chaotic state of early web development. Code was just everywhere. Business logic was totally tangled up with user interfaces, and scaling apps was an absolute nightmare. But then in 2000, Apache Struts arrived. It was this open-source beacon of hope that brought much-needed structure, which eventually sparked powerful successor frameworks in the mid-2000s, and a major evolution with Struts 2. Section 2. Popularizing MVC architecture. A real paradigm shift. This brings us to what is arguably the biggest paradigm shift Struts brought to the table, the Model View Controller, or MVC architecture. You probably know it well. MVC separates an app into three interconnected pieces. The model handles the business logic, the view takes care of the user interface, and the controller handles the requests. By splitting up these concerns, developers weren't just dumping code into one messy bucket anymore. They could finally build incredibly maintainable, scalable apps. And beyond MVC, Struts came packed with some seriously revolutionary features for its time. It brought in custom tag libraries to simplify dynamic web pages, which was a massive time saver. It used form beans and action classes to perfectly manage the flow of data. But the real kicker? It utilized XML-based configuration files. This was a highly novel approach back then. It gave developers the flexibility to tweak settings without constantly rewriting the core code. Let's move to Section 3 and see how this builds. Inspiring modern Java frameworks. So while that XML configuration was groundbreaking at first, it eventually got, well, pretty heavy. Enter Spring MVC. Spring took the MVC pattern that Struts popularized, but heavily improved on its limitations. It introduced inversion of control, or IOC, meaning the framework seamlessly wires your custom objects together for you. And instead of drowning in endless XML files, Spring MVC introduced elegant annotations, which drastically cut down on boilerplate code. But Spring wasn't the only one taking notes here. Java Server Faces, or JSF, also drew huge inspiration from the Struts MVC model. JSF took things in a slightly different direction by focusing on component-based development. It gave developers these rich, ready-to-use UI component libraries and seamless integration with IDEs. The whole goal was to radically increase developer productivity, all built squarely on the conceptual groundwork that Struts laid down. Which brings us to Section 4, the need for Struts 2. Evolving the framework. You know the saying, in tech, if you aren't evolving, you're becoming obsolete. The original Struts framework was a massive success, no doubt. But as the landscape shifted rapidly, why was there a sudden need for Apache Struts 2? Well, ironically, the very features that made the original so powerful eventually became its bottlenecks. Developers desperately needed a way to cut through all that growing complexity. So the Apache team tackled this evolution head-on. Step 1, they recognized the absolute limits of those heavy XML files. What used to be flexible had become incredibly cumbersome. Step 2, they made a massive pivot by adopting a convention over configuration approach. This was huge. It meant the framework would just make sensible default assumptions, saving you from manually configuring every tiny detail. And finally, Step 3, they refined their tag libraries to seamlessly support modern web technologies. Section 5, Security Challenges and Lessons. A bit of a cautionary tale. Now, this part of our pioneer's journey is definitely a cautionary tale. Despite its widespread success, Struts faced significant hurdles when it came to security vulnerabilities. When a framework is used this widely across global enterprise applications, any security flaw becomes a major, high-profile event. These challenges acted as a critical turning point, shining a spotlight on the absolute non-negotiable need for constant maintenance and regular updates within open-source projects.
Our source material sums this up perfectly. These issues underscored the importance of maintaining and updating frameworks to address emerging threats. So the crucial point here is that this wasn't just a lesson for the Struts team, it was a wake-up call for the entire software industry. It forced everyone to realize that robust security measures and active maintenance simply couldn't be an afterthought anymore.
Section 6. The Open Source Legacy. A lasting impact. Let's zoom out from the code for a second and look at the sheer impact Struts had on software culture as a whole. Before Struts, there was a ton of skepticism in the corporate world about open source software. Like, could it really be trusted with mission-critical applications? Well, Struts absolutely shattered that doubt. It proved that open source projects could provide incredibly reliable, enterprise-grade solutions. It fundamentally gave major organizations the confidence to adopt and actually contribute to open source software. And this brilliantly illustrates its enduring legacy today. Struts standardized structured Java web development. It paved the way for modern juggernauts like Spring Boot, it heavily influenced the Play framework, and it aggressively promoted an enterprise open source culture. The concepts introduced by the single framework back in the year 2000 literally became the baseline standards for the entire industry. Which leaves us with this final thought. Struts paved the way for Spring Boot, solving the specific structural problems of its era. But technology never stops moving. So what framework will set the standard for the next generation? As we push further into new eras of development, what new pioneer will step up to redefine the web just like Apache Struts did? That is definitely something to keep your eyes on. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did.